What I'm going to do for about 30 minutes is show you some pictures. They're pictures largely from a book that comes out in exactly 2 weeks' time. You are the first school to get to hear about it. It's about global issues, worries, and hopes that people have. I like diagrams, I like maps, I like graphs, so you're going to get a few of those. What you're looking at there is a map of the world, shaped by children, so every country is the size and number of children it's got. Different ways of looking at things. Here's the cover of the book, right? So it's designed to get your attention. Right? If you imagine going into a bookshop, and that's on the table, you're going to notice it. Book covers are also designed so that when they're really little, they work well on websites. Because most people who buy a book do it online. So the title has to work. The next crisis, what we think about the future. I don't know how many of you have worries about the future, or you're worrying much more about which of your friends you're going to see this weekend. But people tend to have worries. They come up at different times. I'm going to show you a couple of things before I get into the book. The first is a worry that some of you may have, particularly as it was very hot yesterday and you might have thought, this is unusual. That's a graph of global emissions of carbon going up. It's one of the few things that is not just rising in the world, but rising faster and faster. So it's a worry. I did a book called Slow Down, and I found only 4 things that were going up and getting faster. One was emissions, the second was temperature, the third was the number of flights, number of aeroplanes in the sky, and the fourth was the number of university students worldwide. Now we know that the university student one won't carry on going up forever, because you can't have more than 100% of people going to university. But the emissions and the temperature and the flying is a bit of a worry. I'm going to take that graph and I'm going to show you a different way. Now that's exactly the same data, right? And on the vertical axis, you've got the amount of carbon in billions of tons being released each year. But now on the horizontal axis, you've got how much was it going up or down in a year. So you're looking more at the subtleties of things. And you can see it does go down. It goes down when you have global recessions. When the economy doesn't do well in the world, people produce less and they buy less and we emit less. Going to show you one other thing that you may worry about and try to explain why you shouldn't worry about it. And because you might get bored, I thought I'd put all the way through this attempts at hope, which I'll give it away now, were produced in 1914. And the first one is, love your school fellows, they're going to become your fellow workers and companions in life. So it's Friday, right? Be nice to each other. Here's something that you may worry about. Number of people in the world. Too many, loads of people, more and more people. We're going to have so many people, we've got no hope of all fitting in the world. It's going out of control. And let me do the second commandment. Love learning, which is the food of the mind. Be as grateful to your teacher as to your parents. Right? We'll see later why I'm doing that. So there's a graph of world population and the runaway train. Right, can you guess what that graph looks like if we just change it as I did the last one? I'll show it. There it is. World population going to about 10.5 billion. We're about just over 8 billion now. And now on the horizontal axis, you're seeing how much is it going up each year. And it was going up loads and loads when I was born. In fact, I'm the birth year of the highest increase in births in global history. I'm a 1968 birth. But then we got to a point by 1990 when it carried on going up by the same each year, the same number of millions, about 85 million more people a year. And now, see, it's gone past 220, heading towards 230. The number of people in the world is going up less each year than the year before. The main reason it goes up is not you. It's not young people, it's not children, it's not babies. The number of babies in the world, the real peak was 1990. There was then a mini peak when they had their kids. But we're having less and less babies every year. The main reason it's going up is people like me. I don't look it, but I am fitter than a 57-year-old would have been 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago. So world population is rising because older people are living longer. If life expectancy doubles, if it goes from 40 to 80, then the same number of human beings results in twice as many people being on the planet at any one time. So the rise isn't necessarily bad news. The slowdown is incredible. This data is a few years out of date. The last couple of updates have shown it slowing down even faster. Everywhere in the world, people are having fewer children. Healthcare is still generally getting better, but life expectancy isn't going up like this. It can't. And you are the first human beings in the history of our species who are probably going to see the number of human beings fall before you die. And that's quite an incredible thing. I was told when I showed this graph to a set of scientists, next one, it's too complicated, but I'm going to show it you anyway. It's the same data again, human population, still going up on the vertical axis, still the annual change on the horizontal axis, but now I've put a log scale on it so that the little changes in the past, and there weren't many of us, are obvious. And it shows three major events occurring in the world over the last 2,000 years. The first was 1492, when some of us Europeans got 3 ships and went across the Atlantic and took our germs. That killed a lot of people. Human population growth slowed down when we from Europe turned up in the Americas. The second is around the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. And that again was us, a bit more British than the Portuguese and Spanish one. That's invading many other countries and creating colonies. Doesn't tend to help initially populations when you do that. And after you've invaded other countries and colonised them, population rises and rises. But that last turn is due to women getting power. Women getting power over themselves, being seen as fully human, being able to make choices, not having to do what men tell them to do. Going to click forward again quickly because I want to get onto this book, but I'm just trying to give you an idea of the kind of issues that you can look at. If you go to university, you do geography. You don't need to go to university and you don't need to do geography, but this is the kind of thing we talk about. We talk about the human geography and state of the nation, and you can see from that title that we're not currently in a particularly happy place as the UK. All that graph is telling you is that this country was very, very unequal 100 years ago. The rich had more money than they'd ever had, which is why they could have enormous country houses with hundreds of servants. The most common job that the young women in this room would have done just over 100 years ago would have been to go into service and be a servant. That was the most common job for women in the past. It's only after that you have things like textiles, the potteries and so on. Okay? By the 1960s, we'd largely got rid of servants. I'm going to click through again because I want to get onto world issues. It's a bit depressing looking at the UK at the moment. This is the most complicated graph I'm going to show you. It's how much money we spend on public good, on public things. The red line is the UK, and you can see it kind of goes up over time, right? So we now spend a bit more than we've ever spent, but we've got an aging population. The tax rate's at the highest it's been for 70 years. But if you look at all those other lines, you'll see that other countries in Europe spend more than us. In the rest of Europe, they have hardly any private schools, so all the schools have to be paid for by the government. That costs the state a bit more. It's cheaper overall. Private schools are really expensive, but it costs the state a bit more. The rest of Europe spends more money on its health services. In Germany, they spend an extra €1 billion a week as compared to what we do, and that costs more. They might spend more money fixing the roads, making the housing system work better, all kinds of things. We're at the bottom. We're the lowest taxing and public spending large country in Europe. Often politicians tell you there's no option, you can't do anything else. The nice thing about geography is it points out, oh, look at those other countries. How come they managed to do it? There are two spikes in the graph if you're wondering and you've got good eyesight and your brain isn't completely addled by Friday afternoon, is the 2008 banking crisis, when all these countries had to spend more money because the banks were going to go bust. We never got the money back from them, by the way. And then the most recent spike is COVID-19 and the public spending required in 2020. When you need the money, you can find it. Currently, we're on a down again. The last depressing thing to show you are a couple of quotes from Stephanie Flanders, who's, I think, still ahead of Bloomberg News or something like that, and John Byrne Murdoch, who works for Financial Times. And these are just very neat summaries of the state of the UK. We are currently worse off, at least the poorest fifth of people in this country are worse off than the poorest fifth in most of Eastern Europe. So you're living in a peripheral European country that isn't doing well. It's because of things like this that I got tired of writing about the UK, but I'm going to show you one last book, and then we'll do world crises. But I don't want you to think everything is bad because lots of things are bad in the UK. You happen to be living at the most unequal time since the 1930s. You happen to be living in the most unequal country in Europe, give or take Bulgaria. Most divided, most politically uncertain. We got local election results coming out today from yesterday. We have 5 parties now. Population is almost as divided as the population of the United States politically over what to do. And that kind of thing happens. You get those kind of divisions when things are going badly wrong. This book is about 7 typical children and the lives of 7 typical children and the context. It's death by graph. These are the incomes of the families of 7 typical children. There were 14 million children alive around 2018. I just sorted them by how much money their mum and dad had, or in some cases just their mum, very rarely just their dad. From the richest child to the poorest child, I put those 14 million into 7 groups of 2 million, and I took the middle one from each. The income distribution is shown in that pie chart. You can see child number 7 has more money, or their family do, for food and soap and maybe a holiday and bus tickets than child 1, 2 and 3 put together. Right, so when we say we're the most unequal country in Europe, what that means, what inequality means, is a lot of people getting by on very little and a few people getting by on more. But child number 7, their mum and dad, after paying taxes and after paying the mortgage, were making £25,000 each a year, around about 2018. They were running a corner shop. Running a corner shop well puts you in the middle of the top 2 million children out of 14 million. All the people you think of as really wealthy are the families above that best off child. Cost of living crisis. We are currently in the second longest cost of living crisis in British history. It began in 2008 with the banking crisis. Real wages, that is, wages compared to the cost of buying things like food, fell. That's the red line going down. They then began to rise again, but didn't quite get back to the level of 2008. Before, halfway through the pandemic, the prices began to rise again. And so we're down here again. The previous longest cost of living crisis was 1798 to 1822. a long time ago. So if you're ever thinking this isn't great, you are completely correct. The great news for you if you're young is you're almost certainly going to watch Britain no longer at some point being the most unequal country in Europe, because it's really hard to keep that position. And you're probably going to see rises in living standards at some point that will be quite stunning. Because if you start off from such a low base, if you start off from the current situation we're in, with the quality of housing we've got, the health service falling apart that we have, it's relatively easier to get a big boost. The second graph is about inequality. It was incredibly low when I was your age. The only other large European country as equal as the UK was Sweden. I grew up in a Scandinavian Nordic kind of country called England. This is what the numbers show. Huge kind of cultural revolution in the 1980s, when the idea that inequality is good was sold. We became very unequal. We're still very unequal. That near graph is about inequality falling. It's going down slightly in most countries in Europe. Don't believe people when they tell you that inequality is rising everywhere. It is rising worldwide when you compare the 50 billionaires and Musk and the bottom 500 million people. But if you ignore the 50 billionaires at the top, then we're not actually seeing a worldwide rise in inequality. In fact, there's been a huge increase in inequality worldwide the last 40 years, mainly due to China, which took the largest number of poor people ever in world history and moved them up faster than has ever happened before. But within countries, inequality generally is now falling slightly. The last graph, before we get on to world crises, which are, in a way, more interesting than talking about things going wrong in the country. This last graph is the latest United Nations data on changes in child poverty in every country that the United Nations measures. And I think it's a 7-year period ending around 2021-22. And it's really good news. All those blue and purple bars are about really big falls in child poverty in lots of countries. And you see most of the bars are heading towards me. In most of the countries the United Nations measures, child poverty is falling, because people care about child poverty, they do something about it. But right at the top, if you've got very good eyesight, is the United Kingdom, and we had the biggest rise. Somebody has to be at the top of these league tables, right? The tragedy is at the moment it's us. Hopefully, that's the end of that. Okay. And I've got about 15 minutes to tell you about crises in the world. And we got some quotes again. Do not hate or offend anyone, do not seek revenge, but stand up to your rights and resist tyranny. That graph is showing the frequency of the use of the word crisis. In the past, people didn't used to talk about crises. In the 19th century, when we had epidemics every other year and pandemics every 10 or 15 years and wars across Europe, we didn't talk about crises because that thing was just normal. It wasn't a crisis, it's what happens. It's only been since the 1960s that we started using the word more and more. And in a way, it's because life, at least for better off people, became more stable that we can start worrying about crises. Polling firms, in this case Ipsos Mori, survey tens of thousands of people every month around the world in about 30 countries, asking them what worries them the most. And in the countries that they don't survey, such as China, the Chinese Academy of Social Science also surveys its population. So we have an idea about what people think the biggest crises are. I've grouped them into 6. The biggest crisis by far across the world, and also when you ask people in this country, is inequality, poverty and cost of living. Just getting by. Right? It's for adults overall, but that's the thing people worry about most. It's a good thing that they do, because you're not going to do something about something if you don't worry about it. The second biggest one is sharing the work, unemployment, worrying that immigrants are going to take your job, which is really, really silly, because when people turn up from somewhere else, it creates employment. If I didn't go off to see my mum and dad tonight, but I stayed here and I found a job to do. Then the extra me and the money I had would create more work for people in the corner shops where I bought things from. All my spending locally would create more work. Right? If people come to a place, it does better. You don't want to be in a place that people are leaving. Third, war and crime. Fourth, cradle and grave issues like healthcare. Only fifth, the climate crisis. And sixth, the environment and biodiversity. Those are the big crises. Commandment number 6, be not cowardly, protect the feeble and love justice. Economists often say that people are doing better, that poverty is falling, because they have a measure of poverty, which is, are you living on the equivalent of just under $2 a day? Now that did fall, but it's such a tiny amount of money. You're poor if you're above that. 2 or 3 times, 4 times that amount of money is still poor. It didn't fall because of world trade. It didn't fall because of capitalism. It fell because we began to have fewer babies after 1968. And the babies in particular we stopped having were babies who would have been poor. Because the mothers then, who were getting the most extra choice, were poorer mothers. 2. I'll let you read commandment number 7 yourself. Second biggest fear. And this is a middle class survey. When you do a worldwide survey in countries, the poorest people don't fill in your survey. In fact, you never get to them because they're not on the internet. So these surveys are actually concerns of the better off half of the world, the best off 4 billion people. But equally, if you ask people in detail about their fears in this country, the second biggest fear is unemployment. Your chances of being made unemployed are not that high. But that doesn't mean it's not frightening, because the consequences are big. You will probably have a worry about your future in terms of what will I do, who will want me, what will I be trained for, will I get a job? The gnawing away of those worries creates a fear, and it's a crisis of insecurity. Number 3, war and crime. Now, most of this fear is about crime. Most of it is people being afraid of being burgled, being mugged, okay, and that kind of thing. But the bigger part of people are less fearful of it, but the implications are much bigger, is fears of war and terrorism. Take some data. Those circles are all the countries in the world which have had deaths as a result of war, as counted by academics in Sweden, since 1989 to, I think, around about 2022. And the size of the circle is proportional, the area is proportional to the number of deaths. So if you actually want to know who suffers most from the crisis of war, it's the people living in those countries. But that's different from the geography of who is frightened about war. These things can be altered by the kind of questions you ask. There's a particular survey that asks about nuclear war, and I think did so at a time when Ukraine and Russia were getting particularly ferocious with each other, that found that half the population of the world are quite worried about nuclear war. One problem about worries and crises is that most of the time, hopefully, you're not that worried about too many things, because you can't worry about many things. Right? Most of the time you're worried about, when is this man going to stop droning on at us? How near are we to the bell at 3:10? Is the person I really want to chat to going to be there in the playground 20 minutes after that? What am I going to get to eat tonight? Am I going out with other people on Saturday? What's the plans for the bank holiday weekend? And then maybe, what's happening in those elections in the news, but that's probably a minority view, although you'll get it through Instagram and Snapchat and things. And maybe some of you more fundamental concerns. I'm really worried the planet's heating up, I'm going to have no future. I haven't got time, and it wouldn't be fair to survey you, but I'd love to find out a way of actually finding what concerns an audience has. But I've triggered you already. I've shown you a whole load of issues that are worries. We've got 3 more to get through. Cradle to grave issues. In China, these are the biggest issues. People in China are less worried about inequality and poverty. That's despite having greater inequality than we have in the UK, roughly the same as the USA. Why is there less worry about it in China? Because the standard of living rose so much. 99.5% of people are better off than their grandparents, much better off. Okay? There's less worry about unemployment, except among the upper middle class. The concern is healthcare, because there's a lot of very elderly people in China. If you were in China now, you very likely would not have a brother or sister. You'd still be an only child, even though that policy has ended. Most people who have children only have one. You'd have 2 parents and 4 grandparents, and you would be their only grandchild. And that is normal. Okay? And you can see in those circumstances where there's just one of you and 4 grandparents, why healthcare might be a worry. There's also issues about, do you have to bribe somebody to get it? I won't describe through the graphs, just to tell you that the best off 1% of people in the United States, the really richest people, actually richest on earth for a large country, they don't live any longer than the richest 1% in England, despite all that private healthcare that they have. And it's quite incredible. Data is useful for telling you things. Conspiracy theories. My favourite part of looking at people's worries are conspiracy theories. YouGov did a polling of conspiracy theories to find out how many people in each country of the world believe them. That one problem with conspiracy theories is you don't necessarily know whether they're true or not. Well, most of them are not true, but when YouGov began its poll, one of the conspiracy theories it was testing was whether people believed that the Russians had interfered in Donald Trump's first election. And then news broke during the poll that they actually had. And so the conspiracy theory turned out not to be a conspiracy theory. There's other problems about what they mean. This is probably the most famous conspiracy theory in the world. It can be worded in different ways, but do you believe that a single secretive group rules the world? I think it's much more fun if you think they have tails and whatever, they're the lizard people. Or yeah. And it's also getting at anti-Semitism. But if you ask people, do you believe a single secretive group rule the world? Well, the people who are in charge do tend to meet together in private. You know, when Tony Blair and George Bush decided to go to war, they didn't invite anybody else to chat with them. When people go and have meetings on yachts, you know, it is largely to be away from other people. The university I work in, Oxford, we have lots and lots of powerful people turn up to chat with other powerful people, you know, and mostly it's not public. That isn't saying there's a global conspiracy, but where do people least believe in this kind of thing? At the bottom is Japan, Denmark, Sweden, and the UK. So we're actually amazingly conspiracy bound compared to other countries. Right. Highest in Nigeria, South Africa, Mexico, Turkey. So the most unequal countries. Climate crisis. Every year, roughly, fewer people worry about the climate crisis than the year before, because they've heard it so often. It gets boring. And that's a problem, because there is a climate crisis, and it's real. But the other crises matter as well. And if you repeatedly tell people this is the most important crisis, ignoring the things in their lives that they're most worried about, you can see why they might switch off. Here's one of these conspiracy theory graphs. Location of people who believe that climate change is a hoax. Right at the bottom you see the UK, we're least likely to think that they're making it up about climate change. Highest, Nigeria, and then the United States. Now, belief in things like that matter a lot politically. If you could get the population, if I could get you to go, don't believe this climate change thing. It's just a bit warmer, but it's very nice. It'll be due to some sunspots and some natural thing, but they're going to make you pay more money for your heating unless you vote for this party that doesn't believe in climate change. I can get you to vote for this party that doesn't believe in climate change. Why does this party that doesn't believe in climate change want your votes? They want it for what they want to do. They may well believe in climate change, but they know they're not going to get the votes from saying that they do. They need to be different. My last slide, so we've got time for questions. And I'm happy to answer questions on anything about universities, about geography, about lectures, about if you go to university, is it really going to be as bad as this? And I'm afraid the answer is it's going to be slightly worse, in that most lectures go on for longer, and so on. The conclusion, and I'm summarising the conclusion of the book, is that we've spent about 200 or 300 years trying to work out how to deal with the current set of crises we have, because they're generally not new. Climate is much newer. We weren't heating the planet up that much 100 years ago. But all the other ones, getting by, poverty, inequality, are you needed, unemployment, violence, these are all old issues. In their current form, they began when we changed social systems, which I trace it back to the 16th century in Amsterdam, to say that the most important thing you could do as an economy is trade, make money, get richer. Right? And that's the modern world system. It's the thing we call capitalism. And we've had the same similar crises since then. It wasn't that the world was wonderful before capitalism, but it was boringly predictable often. You'd all be working in fields. Your parents would have worked in fields. Their parents, going back 6,000 years of working in fields. Right? There were things that happened, but it wasn't that exciting. Start to get capitalism, start to get industrialisation, start to get the mass production of weapons, start to get power and wealth, start to get national borders, start to get nationalism, start to get really large industrialised armies, start to get power amongst men who have unbelievable amounts of money, and you get a new set of things. And there's been lots and lots of what can we do about this. I'm just taking one particular point in all of that, which is East Bradford in the early months of 1914, when they produced that particular banner, and on the back of it were the 10 Commandments of the Socialist Sunday School Society. There were Sunday schools, quite a lot of them in the north of England mainly, where you'd send your kids because you want to get rid of them on a Sunday morning, and then they would learn that set of rules that these people have made up. They don't happen. As far as I know now, there isn't a single Sunday school like this. But these kind of ideas of can we be nicer to each other, can we not be exploited, can we think for ourselves, they carry on. And there are always other people who tell you, you're not actually that clever. I'm clever. Trust me. I have a great idea that's going to make us all better off. Let's put, I don't know, 100% tariff on goods coming into this country. So if you want to buy a toy from Christmas from abroad, it's going to cost twice as much. Because then you can get to make the plastic toys here instead. Don't worry your little heads about how that's going to work. Trust me, it's going to make Britain great again. Right? So we have this tension between the trust us, we know better, and the thinking about it side. The trust us side tends to believe in inequality. They tend to believe that they're very much cleverer than other people, they've got the answers, most people are stupid, you don't really want to tell them what's going on because they might not vote in the right way, make them scared about things like small boats landing on the south coast of England. I have a relative who each time he sees me says, Danny, what are we going to do about the small boats? And I say to him, I won't say his name, but I say to him, you live 600 miles north of the south coast of England, very high up on the hill. Sea level's rising 20 centimetres a century. The boats are not going to get to you. And the people who land on those boats are not going to walk all the way to where you are because it's not worth walking to where you are because there's not enough things to do. And anyway, there aren't that many people landing on the small boats, nothing compared to the number of people who come into Heathrow Airport with papers that are, if you want to worry about who gets in and who doesn't, it's not on the obvious small boats. But anyway, do the people turning up actually cause a problem compared to the people who don't turn up to staff the hospitals with the skills needed and do the other things? And why can't you move around and do other things? I've waffled on too much. That bell is going in just over 10 minutes. Please ask me anything, tell me something I've said that's annoying, whatever you want. I'll try and keep my answers short. Who's got a question? Stick your hand up. You at the back first.
What do you think is the most important thing we can do as a nation to reduce climate change?
The most important thing we can do to reduce climate change. Not say we only admit 1% of it and so it doesn't matter what we do, because that's innumerate. We have less than 1% of the world's population, so the fact we emit 1% means we're already emitting more than we should. But my favourite little stat is because we started digging large amounts of coal out before anyone else, a couple of decades ago, half of the extra carbon atoms in the atmosphere were British. Right? We're really, really, really responsible. So it's recognising that responsibility and we're not important. There is no other country on earth that's contributed more to carbon pollution than us. It's not our fault, we didn't know. But we should be at the heart of it because we have this historic position. And it's that argument. Then carry on doing what we're really good at. So we have an agreement between the political parties, it's near to breaking, but it's still there, of not using this as a football because they all know it's true. But you could get votes by saying, it's a hoax. And we have an agreement between our media platforms not to sensationalise and produce a documentary going the great climate hoax, which is why we have the least climate scepticism in the world. And we should congratulate ourselves. We do really badly on lots and lots of things, but that's good. Then there's a lot more you could do to work out how to get to a better position. The emissions are heavily, heavily skewed to better off people. Most people on Ryanair or EasyJet flights are social class A, B or C1. 25% of all flights in this country are taken by just 1% of people. Many of them flying many times. I was one of these. When the pandemic hit, I had 11 flights booked. Well, I didn't realise how much I used to fly. It's easy, but I'm kind of already, my personal budget's shot. But realising that reducing the excess of people who can afford to simply burn up is a really effective way. The carbon emissions of the super rich are astronomical because they have private jets, because they have giant cruise liners in the Mediterranean burning, And it's so the fastest way to reduce emissions is to increase economic equality. And one nice thing is that the answers to these solutions tend to be similar. Who else had their hand up? Yes? Shout loud. Is geopolitics worth pursuing as an interest? Yes, but there's lots of very different kinds of geopolitics. So how am I going to put this nicely? The person who sells far, far more books than me in geography is called, you might know his name, Tim Marshall. Prisons of Geography? Yeah. And Tim Marshall does a geopolitics geography that says this is all about how these countries are arranged and where the mountains are and, where the natural resources are, which is a very kind of old-fashioned geopolitics, which kind of fits Russia and Ukraine and however Trump pronounces rare earths. I think it's worth pursuing, but looking at it more generally about how did Europe rise to this position from being 1,000 years ago, this was really just the far northeast corner of Asia. Right? Europe's a fake continent. There's no reason why we should have a continent called Europe. Cold, damp, wet, mouldy northwest Asia, where human beings didn't even walk in till 10,000 years ago because it was covered in ice, was the back end of nowhere. For various reasons, this part of the world ended up being the richest, and then North America. But that kind of geopolitics that steps back and says, how come it is we thought like this? And realising things. So one reason we're going to get 10.5 billion rather than 9.5 is what's happening in Africa, what's happened in Africa. When we introduced a thing called structural adjustment and cut public spending in the 80s in African countries, the poorest ones, one of the first things which was cut was places for girls in secondary schools. If you make girls leave school at age 10, on average they end up having more children later. And put it very crudely, you end up with an extra billion people in the world. That's not a problem. Partly because the number of children in the world is going down so far. But realising these connections between places, I think is important. There's a kind of optimistic thing about that war map I showed you. Took ages to do, so I'll show you. Try and look for the countries that aren't there. Right? We now don't see war as acceptable. Right? If you go back before 1989, the country with the highest number of war deaths in Europe after 45 was us. They were in Northern Ireland, about 30,000. After that, it was Yugoslavia. Right? We wouldn't tolerate this now. So there are lots of optimistic things about geopolitics, but we tend to concentrate on the worst atrocities going on at the moment, not how well a lot of people quietly work at stopping wars happening. Take another one. Somebody else had. I'll take yours. Right.
You know how you wrote a different book?
Yes.
How many copies have you sold of that?
Of that book? That's a very good question. I don't actually know. I know how much money I make.
How much money do you make?
The most I make from a book the most I would make would be 15,000. The least I would make would be £100. So it would be quite hard to live off the money you make from writing books. There's a writer called George Monbiot, and he publishes his earnings from books, and it's really good because it makes every other book writer feel really good because you think. There's about 10 writers with J.K. Rowling at the top who make a fortune out of books. And then there's children's authors who some of them don't do badly. And then everybody else isn't making enough money because that's a one-off. That's not 15,000 a year, that's £15,000 once over 40 years. And I've written 59 books, and they take ages. So it's not a good way to get well off. But there aren't. I wrote one book called Inequality in the 1%. And one set of questions I often got about this was, what do I have to do to get in the 1%? You know, people are very interested in how to get rich. And it's not easy, otherwise a lot of people would. The fastest way is to marry a rich person. But anyway, yeah, looking. But you're not necessarily going to be happy if you do that. And also that isn't very easy either. You had a question, I think.
What do you think of the growing concerns for the Chinese century?
What do I think about the growing concerns for the Chinese century? I'm not too worried about it because I think it'll be different to when America or when we were in power. You know, we were very bloodthirsty. You know, we invaded, uninvited, 90% of the current members of the United Nations. We always talk about how we ended slavery. We don't talk about how we began it. You know, it's not good. I'm optimistic that this will be something different, that China doesn't have and has never had a desire to actually take over other territory a long way away from China, but is interested economically. I went to Shanghai in January, and I was a bit worried about going to Shanghai, only slightly. I'm not that important, but we'd arrested somebody in Canada a few years earlier, and then somebody in China had been arrested. You do this tit for tat where you put people in jail. Right? And I thought, just my luck, it'll be a geography lecturer from Oxford. And I was going with my son, who was 18. I thought I'll get into so much trouble if I'm arrested, and he has to get back on his own. Why I'm telling you this story is that my university issued its first cascade travel warning to all staff just before Easter. And this wasn't a travel warning about going to China. It was a travel warning about going to the United States of America for anybody working for the University of Oxford. Because people were being stopped on the borders, held, sometimes in effect imprisoned. And I think the people in charge of my university, they wanted to arrest at Easter, and they didn't want to be dealing with members of the staff being locked up at the US border. But to go from being worried in January of this year about China to then worrying about the United States. I mean, this is a country that said it might invade Mexico, it might invade Canada, it might invade Greenland. Right? It doesn't take very far to to work out, we're kind of like not quite, we're the next one over. So I worry less about China partly because of what's going on. But it's connected. Elon Musk's car factories are around Shanghai. Don't think there's a USA versus China. Elon Musk's mother repeatedly flies into Shanghai. So the idea there really is a battle between China and the USA doesn't kind of work that well when you look at where the richest man in the world actually has his financial interests. It really isn't a kind of Tom and Jerry, them against them thing going on. Could take one or two more, and then I promise to stop. Go on.
What do you think the benefits of taking geography at a high level are?
What are the benefits of taking geography at a high level? The Royal Geographical Society used to say, do geography, the average salary of geographers is number 10 of all university degrees. There's about 100 degrees. And so they used to try and sell it on, you should do geography because you'll be rich. That isn't true. We did used to have an unusual number of geographers who became bankers and financiers, and that brought the average up. The most likely thing, if you do a geography degree, there's loads and loads of things you end up doing, because it doesn't set your future. But of all the many, many things, geography teacher is the most likely to do, which is not necessarily a bad thing. There's a stability. The subject changes over the course of your lifetime. I was taught, at your age, to get my A-level grade, I had to write about global cooling and the ice age that was coming. Right? So what's nice about geography, it's not like maths where it's basically the same every decade. Geography actually changes because our understanding changes. One key thing that geography helps with is not forcing you down a particular route. So if you go and do law and decide after 3 years that you don't actually like law firms and what they do when you discover it, you're a bit stuck with your law degree. Right? If you do medicine but realise that you're going to spend the whole of your life with very ill people all the time, it's a bit late by the time you finish your medical degree. Nobody really expects you with a geography degree to put on a pith helmet and go out and explore or do things. It's a general degree in being a small expert at many, many things. That means you understand climate change, you understand maps and graphs, you understand society, you understand theories. People will teach you for the rest of your life about colouring and with crayons. But that's quite a nice thing because it's not in that way a snobby subject because of the colouring in jibe on that. But I would do it if you think you really want to. But if you're going to go to university to do it, I would look primarily at the place you're going to and think, how interested am I at being in that place for 3 years? Is it near here and you're not going too far away? Or do you really want to be in a big city? And look at that and the cost of living there and the cost of rent and what you'll learn from living elsewhere. The other thing that people never do in the UK, young people don't do, is they don't look at going abroad. I almost have stopped saying this because nobody does it. There are still countries in Europe which will take you as a student and sometimes support you, and it can cost less than doing a degree in the UK. Last one from anybody? Promise it's last. That bell's going to go any minute, isn't it? You know it. I can feel the tension rising. Anything at all? No? Thank you ever so much.